Hi, everyone. Welcome to the movie year in review panel here on the Anime Detour stream. My name is Mark McPherson. I'm a film critic for TwinCitiesGeek.com, FilmInquiry.com, FilmChop.com, and my own blog at MoviesWithMark.com. So I write quite a bit about movies, and yeah, it's been a pretty interesting year for for film. If you look back all the way over from from 2020 and how things have kind of proceeded since. So this is going to be more of an interesting discussion about the films that we've had in the past year. So typically, the way that I usually do this panel is that we just kind of like run through the more notable titles we're talking about of the year. But also, I think we can't avoid talking about the subject of how like the industry has taken such a big change in such an amount of time. So we'll cover a little bit. So to set the stage, I'll bring it all the way back to like the beginning of 2020, when we were still having still having films in theaters. Like the coronavirus was just like starting to hit, and we had like the pandemic hit and that shut down theaters. So there were like a few films that got into theaters early in the year that I was actually quite impressed by. One of the first big films that I was really impressed by was The Invisible Man, a film by Lee Winnell, who a lot of people know from who's been a fairly notable name in horror. He's done stuff like within like the Conjuring universe and a few other horror films he's been involved with. And it was really surprising to see this pursuit of like another universal monster, especially after like the failed Dark Universe. Because I know that's what a lot of people were thinking, after the failure of 2017's The Mummy, where they tried to revive the Universal monsters into a cinematic universe of the Dark Universe, and it just kind of like took off and crashed before all these big plans could come about. But in place of that, we got stuff like The Invisible Man, which I thought was a great interpretation of this classic movie monster, with that had more of a societal edge to it. Like it felt like a more interesting and relatable story. And the biggest thing about it is that it makes the monster seem more sinister past just being invisible. It's more about what this character has done behind the scenes and how this villain sort of gaslights people. And especially like a great performance by Elizabeth Moss. Elizabeth Moss has been like one of those women who just keeps rising up in horror. You see her in like supporting roles and stuff like Get Out. And you've also seen her dominate in films like Her Smell and Queen of the Earth. And once again, she dominates here. Like she's one of those women like that to keep an eye out for, because she is fantastic in horror. She has this great performance that's both like concerned and gritty and just paranoid and constantly fearful and distrustful of the world, and she just gives one of her better performances. So the year started out pretty strong when we had that film debuting quite early. Another film worth noting from that time was Birds of Prey. DC Comics films were heading in a different direction after after like the DCEU kind of more or less tried to split off and to go to its own things after Justice League. Like Aquaman tried to be its own thing. You had Joker, which had nothing to do with the DCEU. You had Shazam, which was a much different tone. And then you have Birds of Prey, which basically took, Margot Robbie's performance as Harley Quinn and then brought it out of Suicide Squad and gave her, a film that allowed her to breathe more, an R-rated neon heist film that could be violent, that could be, explicit, have fight scenes where people broke bones and shattered things, and just have just this manic sensation to it, where like it feels kind of more like a Guy Ritchie type film. And I mostly say that just because there was another Guy Ritchie film that came out at the time, The Gentleman, which was another manic type heist film. So, which again, when I think back on all these films early in 2020, that it was like that was for the films that we did get in the theaters, that was pretty damn good for the first start of the year. Now, now, eventually, like for a lot of people, might be questioning, oh, but when did the pandemic hit and like shut down theaters? And I can tell you exactly when, which was um, the middle of March. And like the last, and I remember vividly the last films that I saw, and I didn't know that these were going to be the last films that I was going to see for quite a few months in theaters. Um, and I actually saw like two films that day. The two films I saw was in the morning. I went to go see The Hunt, which was a lot of people might remember The Hunt was originally going to come out in 2019. It was basically this thriller about where, like, it's basically for anyone who's seen The Most Dangerous Game, where humans are hunted, except in this context it's like uh a bunch of like wealthy elite stuffy liberals who kidnap a bunch of conservatives and hunt them for sport. It was initially pulled, I believe, because there was like backlash, because like conservatives thought it was going to, inspire more violence, even though when you think about it, this type of story, usually the people who are hunted are not the villains. And sure enough, that's what ended up happening with The Hunt. I found it to be a very messy film. It's very all over the place. It's like that's sort of like scattershot satire that you would see in something like South Park, where not all of it sticks, and the humor just doesn't really work in a lot of the scenes where it's going for. It's got some great action though. I will admit the best thing about the film is that you do have Betty Gilpin in a great and a fantastic amount of action sequences. I just think the story and the message is so muddled that it made me feel bad, because like Betty Gilpin is fantastic in here. She has a fantastic climactic fight with Hilary Swank, and I'm for as much as I didn't like the film, I do like Gilpin's performance, and I really hope she gets a better action film after The Hunt. So I saw that in the morning, and then later that evening I went to go see Bloodshot, which was a comic book film that starred Vin Diesel, who played an immortal man who has his memory wiped and has to go off killing scientists. Fairly kind of like lifeless, special effects heavy superhero film. It's like, whatever. And then I didn't expect that theaters were going to close at that point. Because like at that time, to paint a picture of what was happening, films were being pushed back in early March. But it was kind of like a slow crawl to eventually getting theaters shut down, as the cases rose and, eventually got to that point. So like the first film to do that was the new James Bond film, No Time to Die. That was originally going to premiere in early April. And then around early March, it got pushed back to November. And it was kind of a case like where I think like the initial idea was that there might have been like some reshoots that they had to do. But when you see how close it was from like release date, that clearly wasn't going to happen. So that got pushed back to November. And of course it kept getting pushed back. Like it got, the James Bond film got pushed back to November 2020. And then when theaters weren't really opening by that time, it got pushed back to, I believe it got pushed back to April of 2021. So right now. And then it's been pushed back again, and I think right now it is going back to November of this year. So, yeah, it's taken its time to come out, even though apparently the film has already won a Grammy because of the theme song, which was already released in 2020 fairly early, the Billie Eilish song. So it's kind of weird when you think about all the marketing stuff that's come out from 2020 with films that had to be like pushed back and haven't debuted yet, where, No Time to Die hasn't come out yet, and it's already got a Grammy nomination for the soundtrack. And you have another animated film yet to come out, Minions: The Rise of Gru, which is not going to come out until next year, I found out. And there's already toys of it out. So it's like I went into Macy's and I found it strange. Like there's toys for a film that the toys were made in 2020 for a film that's not going to come out until 2022, and they're still on the shelf. So bizarre. So theaters closed up in March. And the thing is, like, it was kind of like a weird like game of trying to get like films into theaters, like, who's going to be the first one and who's going to take advantage of, when theaters open back up. Now, at one point when Bond moved, DreamWorks took this opportunity and saw, oh, well, maybe we can hone in on that time slot with Trolls. not knowing that theaters would shut down and they'd have to push Trolls World Tour out of theaters. And Trolls actually became the first film of 2020 to go straight to VOD. Sold for $20 to rent, and it actually did very, very well. Like, I think it made about $100 million in terms of the rental sales that came about because of that. And the thing is, this kind of painted a picture of what would happen with the release model of certain films, because they realized that if you go straight to like VOD rental, you can make a decent profit if you've got a big enough IP behind it. The thing is, $100 million is really, really good for VOD. That's amazing. But in terms of like the money that you could make at theaters, once theaters open back up, $100 million is really good. But if you can get above that, which you can in movie theaters, you tend to want to wait for that. That's why a lot of people are questioning, why haven't we seen stuff like No Time to Die, go straight to a streaming service? Like, apparently Netflix has been pursuing Universal for the longest time to buy up the rights to the James Bond film. Like, they want to spend an absurd amount of money to grab this film, but Universal's holding off because they know that at the theater they can make way more money than anything that Netflix can offer them. Like, they are holding on to properties right now that they know will make $1 billion once theaters are all open up again. And that's why they're holding off on pretty much everything. I mean, a combination of it is that Universal's like specific streaming service right now is Peacock. And Peacock is doing well as a streaming service. I mean, but like their subscriber numbers are pretty high up from last year. And keep in mind, last year they did not have The Office on there yet, which was going to be a huge selling point. And they had actually met exceeded their expectations for the service. That being said, most of Peacock is free with ads. And I don't predict that, like something like the streaming exclusive stuff that they're going to put on their service is going to be under the free with ads service. But then it makes you question, like, well, how viable is it to release it on there? And Universal is in a position where I think they know enough that they can make more money at the theaters than they would from their own streaming service. Because right now they're holding on to Minions: The Rise of Gru, Fast and the Furious 9. They have a new Jurassic World film on the way. These are all like films that come from established franchises that have made $1 billion worldwide. So they're not willing to just like wait for like streaming services. So that's why a lot of these films kept getting pushed back. That being said, however, since theaters were pushed back, this was like an opportune time for smaller films to be taken note of and to have like a bigger presence. So thankfully, like Netflix had their own brand. Like, Netflix always goes for the more prestige pictures. So last year they had stuff like Spike Lee's The Five Bloods and David Fincher's golden era Hollywood biopic Mank. Those all ended up being on Netflix, and they garnered a lot more attention. Netflix films typically tend to gain a lot of attention when it comes to prestige stuff. Like, it happened the following year with stuff like Marriage Story and The Irishman. But the thing is, they always relied on like a hybrid model. Like, Irishman and Marriage Story were being released in theaters because that was a prerequisite for the Academy Awards. But they wouldn't rely on it. They would typically rely on their own platform. So it's an interesting year for them. And it was an interesting year all around because we got a whole bunch of new streaming services that cropped up around that. We had stuff like HBO Max came about in, I believe, around like May, I think it came about. Then we had Peacock, obviously. Disney Plus was already up and running at the end of 2019. And then, of course, like CBS All Access was doing a whole lot. They're mostly like focusing on Star Trek and the Twilight Zone stuff. But now that they're rebranded as Paramount Plus, they are now focusing a lot more of their films onto their service to be more exclusive, to gain, basically have a lot more control over like, the cash flow that would come in for them. So stuff like you're going to see a lot more stuff come up on their service, but like the big one right now is the new SpongeBob film. They were still going to release it into theaters, but as theaters kept opening up and shutting down, they realized that they should just stick with their own service for it. So you'll probably see more of that happen, especially since like Paramount, I believe, is rebranding their own television channel as the Paramount Movie Channel. So you probably might be seeing more original content from them later this year. But as theaters closed for like over half of 2020, like I mean, roughly they closed for the summers, which is like a big time for like blockbusters and a lot of stuff that we expected to come out during that time. The superhero epics like Black Widow and Wonder Woman just didn't show up because a lot of the studios were hanging on to them because they knew they could get more money once things opened back up. So this was more of an opportune time for smaller films to come about that they could, take the reins. People would be talking about them. Golden time for Netflix, golden time for Amazon Prime, which bought up like a lot more properties. Golden time for VOD services, which basically rebranded all this stuff as, the theater at home. You can watch these films at home, which was, it wasn't like a huge shift because the thing is like smaller films had been relying on VOD services for quite some time. It's just that a lot of people really didn't take notice of them because, they were smaller films that didn't gain that much attention. In fact, even before theaters shut down, I was kind of relying on it because there was a film that was coming out in very limited release around theaters called Come to Daddy. Great little eccentric horror film, but I couldn't find like a theater to go see it at because it was only running for like such a short amount of time. It was only running for like one weekend, I believe. So I decided to just go onto VOD services and just watch it there. Like VOD services have been doing this for the longest time. Even with like fairly big films that came about, like Snowpiercer got a bad deal on a limited run, so it went straight to VOD services and did really well. A lot of people will remember back in 2014, there was the controversial comedy The Interview, which didn't debut in theaters because they were afraid about the controversy and that there were going to be terrorist attacks because of it. So it released on VOD on Christmas Day in 2014. So this isn't really kind of like a new shift in terms of like bringing films to VOD. It's just a matter of like, the size of the films that are coming over to VOD now. Because stuff like the Interview and Snowpiercer, big special effects heavy films with fairly notable casts, but their budgets really didn't quite exceed like $100 million. So when you're talking about like a film that cost well over $100 million to make and pushing it onto a streaming service, it's, studios were naturally iffy. They wanted to hold out hope that, you could get stuff back into theaters. And so, of course, the one film that Warner Brothers was hoping that this would happen with, like Warner Brothers was basically setting their sights on theaters reopening. They wanted to be at the forefront. They wanted to be the first film out there that would be like a big return to form for the theaters. And they wanted to do that with a Christopher Nolan film. They wanted to do it with Tenet. Tenet was a film that I had been looking forward to. It's an original, big, seemingly high concept action picture that Warner Brothers was hoping would draw a crowd. And the way the theaters opened back up was kind of interesting. So what happened was the way that theaters opened back up was kind of odd. Like, so around like June, there were certain theaters that were taking precautions that were starting to open back up. And it was only like a handful of like the smaller chains that were doing it. So stuff like Imagine was reopening their theaters. The thing is, because there weren't a lot of theaters open up, a lot of these theaters started just either playing classics or playing very, very, very small indie films. So a lot of films that a lot of people might not have heard of, stuff like Cutthroat City and The Infidel, very, low budget films that they were trying to market out there, were taking up the theater. So it was an opportune time for them to like kind of get into the theater, even though, a lot of people weren't as, comfortable going to the theater when, the pandemic was still happening, but they were still opening up. So a lot of people were waiting for the big return for bigger theaters to open. And that was in the end of August. So around the end of August, You started seeing like AMC's and all the big other chains start opening up their doors, and you had a few films that were starting to become like theater exclusive. So it was interesting. We had like a few different models for how this happened. There were like films that you could only watch at the theaters, stuff like Unhinged, which was a thriller about Russell Crowe playing this killer who stalks a woman through traffic. Fairly forgettable film, but it came to theaters only, so you had to see it there. Another film that was released in theaters only was The New Mutants, a film which had been on the back burner for so long that I believe, like, it was The New Mutants was developed after Logan at Fox as a part of like the Marvel line, but it had been in like it had basically been in like post-production hell for roughly 2 years, I think maybe a little bit longer than that. And it was initially going to come out in April of 2020, but again, because the pandemic happened, it pushed it back even further, and it had already been pushed back way too much at that point. So it just got like dumped into theaters. Like Disney didn't even want to take a chance with releasing it on Disney Plus at the time. So it just went to theaters like that. Now there were like a few hybrid films that were trying both, like going to both VOD and theaters. The first big film to try this was Bill and Ted Face the Music. So it released into the handful of theaters that were open at the time, along with the VOD release. So people either saw it at the theater or they saw it on VOD. Now at the time, the VOD sales outnumbered the theater sales. And initially, that, like, a lot of people might be looking at these numbers and thinking that this is, like, the way that this looks is that, theaters are done for. Like, if the theaters can't pull in this much money and VOD makes more sales, that means like that theaters are done for. But I think that's kind of more of like a range of like looking at, how many theaters are open and how many people are comfortable with going to theaters. Because this was during the same time that Los Angeles and New York were still had their theater doors shut. So the larger markets still didn't have the door open. So like only like a handful of spots around the country were allowing for films to their theaters. Allowing for theaters to be open. Sorry. So when Tenet came about, it was really interesting how they advertised it, because the way that they advertised in the Twin Cities, they had very specific ads for it. So when you have TV bumpers, they will typically, they'll show the trailer, and then they will, say the name of the film, and then they'll say like now playing in theaters, and that'll be the standard one. Or they'll say like, catch a sneak preview here and such. And the way that they ended the bumpers for Tenet was that they ended it by saying, big movies are back in Minneapolis. So yeah, it was very like specific as to like where you could advertise it. And like in some parts of the country, like they were doing more drive-ins, because that seemed to be the easier route. Like I believe around like San Diego and like California, they were doing more drive-in movies, so that people could still go see Tenet, even though it wasn't going to release on VOD services, or just going to be in theaters. So Tenet opened up in the theaters, and it made some money, but like, surprise to no one, it didn't do as well as it could have done if more theaters were opening up. Because even though AMC's and the bigger chains, like a few Regals and stuff like that, were opening up, they weren't opening up in the larger markets. So Tenet just didn't end up making money. And so Warner Brothers basically had to restructure at this point, like quickly. Like Warner Brothers moves incredibly fast with this information. Like they kept pushing Tenet further back and further back, trying to make sure that it was going to be the first big film that would open in theaters. Like it was originally going to open up in July. They heard theaters were going to open in July, so they tried middle of August. When middle of August was going to happen, they pushed it back to September. I believe it fluctuated between like the end of August and September, and they realized, oh well, the end of August they're going to have Bill and Ted, and they're going to have Inception, so we can't quite do that. So they just kept edging it further and further. The same thing happened with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman 84, they really wanted to get that film out there. It was going to be August, then November, then December, then Christmas Day, and then eventually it got around to November, and they're like, oh, what do we do? It's, not all the theaters are opening up. We're not going to make that much money. People are going to want to see this film. So what do we do when these markets aren't open? And for reference, at the time when this was happening, there was a huge spike in cases in Minnesota. So at the end of November, theaters were already shutting their doors again, and they wouldn't open back up until January. So they're basically, Warner Brothers made this very controversial call that a lot of filmmakers despised, which was they decided, look, for 2021, basically, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if things are going to be all clear, if the vaccine's going to take, if cases are going to go down, if deaths are going to go down. So what we're going to do is we are going to release all of our films in theaters, but on HBO Max as well. Now, this sounded like this was a great deal for consumers because it gives them an option. They can either pursue the streaming service and, just watch it at home, or they can go to the theater and watch it on the big screen. And a lot of filmmakers got pissed off about this. Namely, Denis Villeneuve was like, "What the hell? What are you doing?" Because his film Dune had been pushed back further and further and further. It was originally going to come out in October of last year. Now it's October of this year. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It was December of last year. It was going to be. It held on to that time slot for the longest time. Its original set date was going to be Christmas Day, around Christmas Day in 2020, but then it got to pushed back over to October of this year. So Denis Villeneuve didn't know about this. I believe James Gunn was a little bit pissed off about this. Legendary, I know, really got pissed off with this because of Godzilla versus Kong. They thought that this was really going to kneecap their influence in the theater, which initially prompted Netflix to jump up and buy it. Because the one thing to mention about during this time is that Netflix was really thirsty for content. They realized that during this time, if you worked for it, you could buy films that were going to go to theaters and make them streaming exclusives. Amazon Prime had actually been doing this for quite a bit during the pandemic. They latched onto films like My Spy, just kind of like a dopey kindergarten-esque type action film. They lapped that up in summer, and they also grasped Coming to America. Got the rights to that so that they could place it on their own streaming service, which is pretty good. They stole that away from Paramount, which I believe Paramount was willing to let them have. So Netflix was apparently offering an absurd amount of money for it because, like Netflix at this point, they realize that the competition is heating up now. They realize that studios are going their own separate ways, putting stuff on their own services. So now Netflix is eager as hell to grab whatever they can from the market. So they put an absurd amount of money on the table to buy Godzilla versus Kong, and at the time, I believe when they were doing this, Godzilla versus Kong didn't have quite that much of a set date around the fall of 2020. So it came as a big surprise because I don't think we really knew the full release date until either January or December of 2020 when they announced that Godzilla versus Kong was going to be coming out at the end of March. And that was a big surprise because if you announce that in January, this huge film is going to come out in 2 months. And at that point, we didn't have a trailer. There wasn't a lot of marketing resources out there. I think we only had a bit of a poster. So it was really strange because I realized oh man, if Warner Brothers does this, they're going to have to move on the marketing immediately. In the same way they did with Wonder Woman 84. I mean, with Wonder Woman 84, there was at least a trailer out there, but then they had to really push promos and stuff to get that out there. But the good news is that just this weekend, we are actually seeing that the box office numbers for Godzilla versus Kong are good. They're actually really, really good this for its release, considering that it's also releasing on HBO Max at the time. This is kind of a good sign for theaters. It's not doing incredible big numbers that you'd see maybe a Marvel film doing at the time, but it is pretty dang high, from maybe a mid-tier action film that could take a weekend. We are starting to see Godzilla versus Kong hit that mark. far bigger than, the theater exclusive films like Tenet and what are some other ones at the time, stuff like Unhinged and The Croods, which were released around Thanksgiving. It's doing really well. And I think that's mostly attributed to the fact that bigger markets within like Los Angeles and New York are starting to open back up their doors, proving that people do want to go see films at the theaters, which is kind of the stance that I've been holding. Yeah, like AMC has, been pushing that they've had theatrical troubles, but that's basically because there's no way for them to sustain like, the same amount that they would have if they had shut their doors, to keep that revenue going, to keep their company afloat. If the theaters open back up their doors, obviously people do want to go see films on the big screen. I mean, I still do. I can't wait for like, places like the Alamo Drafthouse to open back up. I love going to the theater, seeing something on a big screen and sharing that experience with everyone. That's great. It's a better experience than just watching something at home. And to just say like, hey, watch it at home. You could say the film's good. There's just quite a lot to talk about. But theatrical experiences, you can't beat them. So like, I can't wait. So when we can have like more big films at the theaters, and thankfully it does seem like we're getting more to that point. Obviously, because the numbers are big for Godzilla versus Kong, I think there's definitely you're going to see a higher resurgence of films that will come about from there. Love the Alamo Draft. Can I wait to go back? Yes, I love the Alamo Drafthouse. And the thing is, like the Alamo Drafthouse, for those who have never been to it, the Alamo Drafthouse that's open in Woodbury in the Twin Cities is one of like my favorite theaters ever. Like you go in there and you have all these amazing posters. You have a really great staff there. There's, the best selection of like food and drink. And what I love so much about Alamo Drafthouse is that they have like a huge stage in front of the theater, which makes it the perfect place to have like sort of like activities for like press events. So typically when I go to like see films that have early screenings, there's typically like a big like marketing kind of like push. Like they'll hand out, sometimes they'll hand out merchandise there. They'll have if it's a kids film, they'll have fun stuff for the kids, like like coloring pages and like dorky little crowns and stuff like that. They always do something like that. But Alamo Drafthouse is actually really fun to do that kind of stuff with, because they have like such a huge stage, they can do more with it. Like when we went to the screening for Dr. Sleep there, the sequel to The Shining, they decided to have a tricycle race, with like Danny's tricycle from The Shining. So everyone, all these adults and these tiny little tricycles were basically pushing their way through like a little track they had up front. Birds of Prey was really fun too, because they had because Harley Quinn is in the film on roller skates. They had the roller derby girls were just skating around there in little costumes. I believe some of the staff was actually doing that as well. Yeah, it does kind of have like a classic cinema feel, because kind of, yeah, because it has like those old-fashioned posters up there with like kind of the little bit of like the gilded edges that you'd see in films. I just love the fact that they have a poster for Danger Diabolique, which is one of my favorite kind of like ridiculous B-movie action films. That if you've ever seen it, it's been on like Mystery Science Theater. That theme song will get into your head, and I just think of it every time I go in and see that. So that and the previews that they do are amazing too. Especially if you get there early, they'll play like random clips. Like they'll play like Indian Superman and classic commercials and stuff like that. The best thing to do there is whenever they do kid events, they typically have they have like a breakfast cereal bar, which this was like the best thing ever. Like when we went to the Angry Birds 2 morning screening, typically, you do, there's something there for kids, like there's posters or coloring books or something like that. And at the Alamo Drafthouse, they had a cereal bar. And when I say a cereal bar, I don't mean like, they grab like a handful of like Post cereals and they just slap them on tables. Because they have such a huge stage, they had huge tables of cereal there. And I'm talking every cereal to man at the time. It feels like they just went to like, just went to a grocery store and just rated it, just took everything off the shelf. Like you had every Cheerios possible, every, Frosted Flakes, every, Fruit Loops and Captain Crunch and all that. Oreos cereal, everything was there. It was so perfect. And that's like a regular thing too. They do with like any kids films on Saturdays. And oh god, I my daughter absolutely loved it. That's the best thing ever. That's why I love the Alamo Draft House. So I can't wait for it to open back up. So yeah, in terms of I think theaters are gonna take off again, like, because obviously people do want to go back to the theaters. I think it's a fun experience. And it's good news that the hybrid model can work. Like, it's not going to be like the death of film. Like the people at Legendary, hated the fact that Godzilla versus Kong was going to get this treatment. And it's actually it's turned out pretty well for the film. Like, it's hitting. Like, I believe that even if it did have even if it was only in theaters and didn't have the HBO Max simultaneous release, it still would have probably done the same numbers, and it still would have been like really good. So I think that's a sign that people do want to go back to the theater. So hopeful for the theater. The one thing that concerns me, though, and this is like a big thing that a lot of people kind of missed in 2020, is the Paramount Accords. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the Paramount Accords is a very, very old law that has been in place for the longest time to basically prevent an oligopoly on movies. So the way that this this, it's a court case that dates back to the 1940s, and it's kind of considered like the one thing that kind of like decimated like the golden era of Hollywood. So what was happening at the time was you were starting to see studios were trying to become more protective of how they would show their films. Basically, studios wanted to have their own theaters that they could show their films in. Now, this was troubling because, a studio owning their own theater to show their own films was concerning, because it meant you could have more of a monopoly on there, because if that theater took off and that was the only theater in the area, that was the only stuff you could show. At the same time, they were also trying to make it so like it would be tougher for other theaters to buy their films if they were being like theater specific. So what this meant was, like, sometimes if you wanted to buy a film for your theater, you couldn't just buy that film to show. You would have to buy like a huge package. Like, it's the easiest way to describe it is like, think of like when you have to buy like a cable package if you wanted to watch just one show on one channel. Like, if you wanted to do that with cable, there was no a la carte system. You bought the cable package and that was it. That's why cord cutting became such a big thing. So because that was happening with like big studios, it came to court, and they basically set up what's known as the Paramount Accords, which basically said that theaters couldn't be owned by the studios. They couldn't just show their material the way that it was. They couldn't make package deals. They would have to have a preview where theaters could see the film that they were going to buy instead of just buying it sight unseen, and that they couldn't package up their materials that they were going to push out to theaters. And this was this was like a great thing in terms of it pretty much brought the golden era of Hollywood to an end. But it did allow for more independent cinemas to open up, more independent films to open up. It took down it basically took down the Hays Code pretty much, so that you could have films that were more adults, that could do stuff that you didn't see a lot of like the censored films at the time do, that films that openly had more sex and nudity and violence and talked about more risque and racial things. So a lot of that great independent cinema came about because of the Paramount Accords. It was also interesting because it made a bigger push for television at the time, because a lot of studios were fearing that, oh man, television is just going to ruin movies because everyone's going to watch stuff at home. They're not going to want to go out to the theater. But it actually worked out in the studio's favor, because one of the things that studios like to do was they like to show reruns of their films. And when they realized they couldn't do that when you had more independent films that were going to theaters and there was a steadier flow of new content, that they couldn't just shove their reruns into theaters. They instead started making these deals with television. So around the time in the 1950s, you started to see a lot of studios just, gather together a whole bunch of their films, package them up, and, make deals to show them on television, which was like a big thing at the time. And this always happens. There's always like some big shift that's always going to make people believe that theaters are going to go down because of some new innovation. Like it happened when television came out. They thought, oh man, you can watch movies at home. It's going to ruin everything. It didn't turn out to ruin it at all. Like, because we got more blockbusters that came out. The same thing happened with VHS. VHS came out and they thought, oh, now they can just wait a few months and just get the film to watch at home. What chance do theaters have? Theaters still did well. And I think the same thing is going to happen right now, because now we have streaming content, and then everyone was saying, oh, well, what's the point? Theaters are doomed now. And this happened really early on. Like, seriously, the moment that Netflix started streaming stuff, and this was like back in like 2010 when they had like nothing big on there. They had like Masters of the Universe, like a handful of other films on there. But when that happened, they were like, oh, what's the point in the theater? So we always have this kind of happen where we think that theaters are going to go down. But I think as long as like people, still like the communal experience, movie theaters will still be here. They'll still be around, because like I said, theaters have survived television, they've survived VHS, and I'm pretty sure they're going to survive streaming, especially since the VOD exclusive stuff and the hybrid release stuff. We've had this for like 5 years, and theaters have still been going strong. That we've still had like box office records being broken with stuff like Avengers Endgame, and apparently Avatar re-released and then made more money than Endgame. So I think once theaters start opening back up, they'll still be there. Down with cable packages. Now it's time for every company. Every company has a streaming service. Yep. Yeah, that's the other concern now, because like here's the thing: the Paramount Accords were basically taken down in 2020. Now the reasoning for this was they believed that the codes were outdated, and that they're in their current form, they weren't really needed, because they thought that there's enough anti-trade laws that could prevent this kind of like oligopoly from happening with the studios. And the thing is, like there might be, but the thing is, it's kind of weird. Like it's shifted since then. Like in 2019, before the Paramount Accords were even taken down, you had a situation where Netflix bought a theater. And a lot of people really didn't take note of this because it seemed like an isolated example, but it's really something to take into account when it comes to the Paramount Accords. Because what happened was New York City, for the longest time, had a one-screen theater called the Paris Theater. And the Paris Theater was typically like it was kind of like the art house screen in New York. So basically, like all like the prestige pictures that would only open up in a few markets, they would typically go to the Paris Theater. Well, in 2019, the Paris Theater was losing money. They couldn't stay open, so they eventually shut their doors. And realizing this, Netflix decided to swoop in, buy the Paris Theater, and use the theater specifically just to show Netflix content. Like they bought it up and they opened it back up in November so that they could show Marriage Story. And this is like the big concern about like studios owning stuff. Like, because Netflix basically intends to use this theater specifically just for Netflix content. So they want to show Netflix movies here. They want to show television series here. And like on an isolated level, you can look at it, it's like, okay, well, it's just like the Netflix theater. It's not like going to be like a huge thing. It's not really going to compete because it's only one theater. It's not really going to, amount to like the same requirements made for the Academy Awards. But the thing is, everything has kind of like changed since then. So because now you're starting to see more studios shift over to the streaming format. So then it becomes like a question of, well, how much power do streaming formats have if they want to delve into like the theatrical market? Like how much, is it going to get to the point where theaters are so bad where they could where studios could buy up the theaters and just show their own material there? And that's the real concerning thing here. So like the Paramount Accords were taken down because they thought that, well, we have enough antitrust laws. And you might argue that, well, if the Paramount Accords couldn't stop something like Netflix buying the Paris theater, then what's the point in having them? But that's more of an argument than anything to update the Accords, to change the language of it so that, streaming services like Amazon Prime and Netflix can't just like swoop in, buy a theater, buy an entire chain of theaters, and only show their content at that theater. You would think you would want to update the laws for that, but instead, the Paramount Accords have just been shot down, just because they believe that, oh, don't worry, it's never going to happen with studios right now. But they have the Paramount Accords being taken down during the middle of a pandemic. Like, I believe like the Accords were stricken down in like August of 2020. When theaters were still shut down, they were just going to start opening back up within like a month. And to announce that just seems really dangerous. And it's especially dangerous because the thing is, the Paramount Accords are currently in like in a 2-year sunset period. So basically, the laws that attribute to preventing the oligopoly aren't going to be like fully off the books until like August of next year. And like within like the span of a year, anything could happen. More theaters could go under. They could end up shutting their doors and just lying dormant. They could be relying on any income they could find. And by the time that happens, if you have all these vacant theaters, it'd be fairly easy for a studio to just drop right in and just buy it up and let that happen. So we're in like this very, very cautious era of kind of uncertainty about what's going to happen with movie theaters and how studios are going to react to it. Now, theaters are still, I think it mainly depends on the business right now of whether or not studios can do well enough at the theater to make theaters sustain themselves as independent entities that are not beholden to a studio. And Godzilla versus Kong is a very, very, very hopeful sign that that theaters can return back to their current revenue stream, and that they won't have to shut their doors, and that studios won't get to swoop in and claim a monopoly on all this. So yeah, that was like the most concerning news more than anything when it comes to film from 2020 is that the Paramount Accords were being dropped and there wasn't really a whole lot of consideration about what's going to happen with it. So very concerning, but it all depends. We'll have to see what happens next year once that comes about. But the good news is, I mean, there weren't like any huge films in 2020, like, no huge blockbusters that came about. Like Tenet was a bit underwhelming. We didn't really get any Marvel films. We didn't get another DC film until Christmas with Wonder Woman 1984. But as I said, it was a good time for smaller films to take in. And we did have a lot of great films that would usually get lost in the usual blockbuster season that rose from the depths just a little bit, that people took note of. There were a few that I loved. I loved that a lot more foreign films were starting to get a little bit more air that people are taking note of. Stuff like Another Round, which stars Mad Mikkelsen as a teacher who has to get drunk to prove his theory about how much you can drink and if the experiment will go well. There were a lot of very small independent like A24 films such as First Cow, which is by Kelly Reichardt, a director who I absolutely admire for just the contemplative nature of every one of their pictures. And First Cow was definitely one of my favorite films. I think among everyone in like my critics circles genuinely loved that film just for just how sweet it was. I mean, it's kind of like a vicious film about like attacking like the early ages of like capitalism and like the new frontier of America. But it's also a very sweet film. You have John Magaro and Orion Lee are like the perfect duo who really care for each other. And they basically set up a business stealing milk so that they can make buttermilk biscuits. And they form a little business through that, and they have to compete with a wealthy socialite played by Toby Jones. Just a very like a just like a fairly great film that I would expect from Reichardt. Very great to see that type of film in the market kind of rise up, especially since First Cow was going to come out around April. It got pushed back, then eventually rose onto Amazon Prime. Another film that I was actually surprised with was David Byrne's American Utopia. This is a concert film that like David Byrne's from Talking Heads, and typically I don't really dig concert films, mostly because like it's just like, you listen to a few songs or a few favorites there, and just like generally there's not like a lot of like great consideration for like the sets of like how they make them. It's just like a fairly standard concerts. David Byrne's American Utopia I really like because they have a very minimalist set, but a great series of people working on it, a great band that he's got backing him up, and David Byrne has these fantastic little asides where he talks about parts of the human brain. He talks about American society and voting. He talks about the history of Talking Heads. He just goes all over the place. Eventually he talks about some of the band members too. Just one of the best concert films I've ever seen. It really engaged me. The music is great. His talks are great. David Byrne's great. Spike Lee directed it really well. So I absolutely loved it. Another film that kind of a bit of a sleeper hit, but if you haven't seen it yet, definitely check out Possessor. It's a film by Brandon Cronenberg, who is the son of David Cronenberg, who's worked on stuff like Scanners and Existence and everything. And it is a brutal, like they positioned it as Possessor uncut. I don't believe there's an edited version, but I believe that's just kind of like a warning, like, look, this is going to get pretty explicit. And it does. There's very explicit sex and violence in this. But it's a great story about a corporate assassin who basically possesses people to become an assassin and kill people. Except when she keeps doing it, she keeps losing her identity and her perception of herself within her mental landscape that just gets like scrambled the further that she goes. So very twisty, mind-bendy type story, kind of like a Philip K. Dick on acid type thing. Very surreal, very cerebral, very uncomfortable to watch at times, especially for the gore. But I gotta admit, I was really engrossed in that film. All right, so we got like about less than 10 minutes here. So like I'm just gonna go through like a few of like my favorites from the year, but I will open it up if anyone has a film that they want to mention from the last year that was really great, and that if I haven't mentioned here, they want to bring up, and we can talk about it briefly. But like a few other films that I want to take note of was Wolfwalkers, a great film from Cartoon Saloon, based out in Ireland. And Cartoon Saloon has done a lot of great cartoons I've liked. They've done stuff like The Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea. Very great, kind of like flat design type of animation. Wolfwalkers has been one of the best. Like this is that film I was waiting for them to make. Just that great little Irish folklore story that really resonates well. It has great characters, a great message, just a fantastical setting. This is their best film yet. This is like their Kubo and the Two Strings was to Laika. So I loved it. Eurovision, Caitlin mentioned there. Yeah, I kind of forgot about Eurovision. It came out like just as like the pandemic was hitting, and it really it's one of those films that kind of like grew on me. Like when I first watched, I was like, oh, this is pretty funny. But then as I watched it more, I started to appreciate it a little bit more just for the absurdity of it. It's fairly kind of dry humor. That's, kind of like the dry absurdity of it all. But Will Ferrell does like an amazing job in this show, and it's endlessly quotable. I mean, the whole like "ya ya ding dong." That's everyone quotes that. It's one of those like kind of comedy, like I don't quite want to say like cultish comedies, but one of those comedies that people will keep quoting even though it's not as widely talked about. Like how many times have people been quoting "Ya Ya Ding Dong" online? I know within one of my critics groups, I tried to nominate that song for one of the best songs of the year, and I think it did make on to a few of the critic lists. But yeah, Eurovision is one of those films that kind of grows on you after a while. I really love it. Yeah, and it did bring a little bit more attention to the contest. Yeah, because Eurovision always kind of seemed to be one of those like things that like it would pop up in memes ever so often. Like Eurovision wasn't wasn't really foreign to most people online, because like generally some of those performances would cross over into, you know, like the whole like meme culture and stuff like that, because they're so absurd. But yeah, to have a whole film based around it, it feels like they should have done that sooner, just because it's such like a wealth of just like great comedy, especially since that perfectly fits within the within like the format of, you know, kind of like Will Ferrell's kind of like competition films, you know, stuff like what's it, like Semi-Pro and Blades of Glory, stuff like that. It fits perfectly within that type of like genre that he would do. Let's see, what are some other films you mentioned? Like I'm thinking of Ending Things is another great surrealist film from Charlie Kaufman. It's a lot like Schenectady, New York, in that it's very, very ambiguous. It doesn't lay it out on the table, everything that's happening. And you're going to have to peel through this film with like a fine-tooth comb and maybe watch it a few times just to grasp everything that happens with it, which is always, I love when films do that, when you have to watch them a few more times to get used to it. The one sort of like questionable film in terms of like whether or not it got recognized for as a film for awards or anything was Small Axe. For those who are not familiar with this, this is basically a film anthology series where like I believe like the only film in it that's 2 hours long is Mangrove, and then like the other 4 films in it are generally about an hour long. But they're all directed by Steve McQueen, and they're all about Caribbean and Black people and how they struggled to make their way within like the racist climate of 1970s and 1980s the United Kingdom. It's got some great performances from a lot of people, such as in Mangrove, Letitia Wright has a great performance. In particular, John Boyega dominates the one, I believe it's like the 4th film. It's called like Red, White, and Blue, in which he plays a police officer trying to become one of the first Black police officers that has to deal with you know, a police force that basically won't back him up, and he has to like really struggle with it. And it's probably one of his like, I think it's one of his best performances since like Attack the Block. It always feels like he's underused in a lot of films, and it doesn't feel, it feels like he's at his full potential within like Red, White, and Blue. So it's glad to see that happening. Over the Moon is yeah, another animated film that kind of went under the radar. Like I think it had a little bit of a buildup here. It's been a while since I've watched that. I'll be honest. It kind of like kind of left my memory for a bit. But I remember I did really like the animation in there. And I'm a little bit more forgiving of, you know, animation on a budget. Especially, you know, now that we're in an age where if you put enough ingenuity into something, you don't need like a heavy amount of resources to make a great animated film. And Over the Moon, I think, is a great example of how far you can take the medium in different areas as well. So I really dug that. Yeah, I'm very forgiving. Like I saw another film last year called, it came out around the same time. It's called Animal Crackers, which I believe also debuted on Netflix. And it's very cheap animation, you could tell by it, but in terms of their budgetary constraints, I think they did a really good job with it. So I have a little bit more leniency and a little bit more faith when it comes to budgeted animation. Like it's so easy to just say this isn't Pixar, this isn't Disney, I can't get into it, but realizing that there are constraints and looking at independent animation, I'm more forgiving of it. So based on legendary anime fan here mentioning Neon Genesis Evangelion 3.0 is looking good. So I imagine there's a lot of films looking forward to next year. I can't wait for a slew of films that are going to be coming out this year, particularly stuff like Denis Villeneuve's Dune. Denis Villeneuve is probably the only guy I would trust right now with that material. And I can't wait to see what he does with it once it's finally up on the screen in October. Also looking forward to the Suicide Squad, more James Gunn's quirkiness, this time in an R-rated setting, which I feel like he's most at home with stuff like, you know, Slither and Super. So that'll be fun to see. Oh, yes, we'll also mention Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. Definitely one of the... it was in theaters briefly in 2020, but yeah, that film should be taken note of. It's on HBO Max right now. It's a film about a teenager trying to get an abortion in New York City, and she has to rely on her best friend, and they have to make their way through the city alone and have this tough journey ahead of them. That's mostly silent. There's like very limited dialogue, but it works so well at conveying, the tough situation in that type of drama. It's kind of like the more serious version of the film. A similar film came out this year called Unpregnant. And that film is kind of more like a goofy road comedy. This is kind of like the more serious version of it. So if you want like a little bit of an odd cleanser to that, you can watch both of them for like a strange back-to-back feature. So yeah, there you go. So we're out of time here. So I'll end this panel by saying, just check out my stuff at movieswithmark.com. I've also got a YouTube channel, a Twitch channel, and all that, so you can check it out there. And yeah, I'll be back later for more panels. So I'll see you then.